Hello, I'm Alistair McIntyre of electricscotland.com. As you may know, on my website, on my index page, if you scroll a little bit down the page, you'll find I've got a Scot news feed. And in there, basically, every day I'll put some stories up that are applicable to Scotland, and mostly culled from the Scottish and other newspapers from around the world. Pretty well always on Scottish events and situations. But sometimes I talk about something else that has a relevance to the understanding of situations. Like, for example, on Brexit, I have made some news stories about things come from Italy, Austria, France, Germany, where I think it has an application to Scotland. But because I read the news, international news daily, I just got a bit concerned about the way the Brexit discussion's going in Scotland. And so I thought I would try to put some thoughts in this video about where I think Scotland needs to go, because it's not performing well. I mean, if you look at it, I think it was today or yesterday, the EU basically said, we won't be negotiating with Scotland, we're negotiating Brexit with the UK. So we won't be discussing Scotland, unless it's as part of the UK's negotiations. That pretty much says it all. But the other thing is that if you look at the EU laws they've written in, it states clearly that all countries must have no more than 3% debt to GDP ratio. Right now Scotland's got about 15%. I mean, Scotland is actually worse than all of the EU countries as far as debt to GDP ratio goes. That is simply not sustainable. And even if there's a country in the EU that is above, and some are above, they have to have very clear statements of how they're going to reduce it to 3%. And if they fail these targets, they can be fined. And in fact, Spain and Portugal almost got fined recently because they were not addressing their debt to GDP ratio. And I think the top debt there was something like 5.4%. So Scotland at 15 is just way out of sight. And as I say, the figures you get are off the GERS report. And these are factual figures. I mean, you could argue like stink, you know, that they're not accurate and all kinds of things. But at the end of the day, they are pretty damned accurate. And if you're concerned about the GERS report, I would recommend you to go to the Chokka blog, that's CHOKKA, Chokka blog, because Kevin there is very good at detailing the information behind them and interpreting the figures for you. But it's because of this obsession that Nicola Sturgeon seems to have about being part of the EU that made me look more closely at what's happening in Scotland. And so I think first I kept saying that she shot herself in the foot with Brexit. But I also think that her and her SNP government were anti-Trump. I mean, she stripped Donald Trump of his Scottish ambassadorial role, for example, and she actively castigated him and supported Hillary Clinton. So now that Donald Trump's now the most powerful man in the world, she's basically clearly done the wrong job. And the thing is, she needn't have got involved. There was no reason for her to get involved in the US elections at all. But she decided she just had to talk about it, had to deal with the issues that she thought were right. But as I say, Scotland's a devolved power, but it doesn't have power over international relations. That's a UK government control area. But because she spoke out, she's obviously rubbed Donald Trump up the wrong way. And I know they had a conversation the other day. Of course, no one's saying what he actually said and what she said. But it's very clear that she's an enemy of Trump. An enemy doesn't like people like that. So I hope he'll be big enough to see past her, because after all he's half Scottish, his mother coming from the Isle of Lewis. But we'll just have to see. It's just that she seems to be rubbing all the people up the wrong way. She has no idea about diplomacy, and Scotland doesn't have any trade negotiators. I think she's so fixated on independence, and she realises as an independent Scotland we have no trade negotiators or no diplomats. So she would have to be totally reliant on the EU to run that whole side of Scotland's business for her in an independent Scotland. And that's why she's panicking, in my view. And don't forget, Donald Cameron at least gave us a referendum on the EU, whereas Nicola Sturgeon totally ruled out a referendum on the EU if she got independence. Totally ruled it out. And yet to be a member of the EU, you have to cede quite a bit of your independence to the EU. And surely, if you're going to do that, you should seek the Scottish people's permission to do it. But she totally ruled that out. So I just feel that her grasp of diplomacy and international relations is definitely poor, as is the SNP's. And to be frank, if you look at the state of the country, I mean, our debt is unsustainable. We have to change things. And we're going to have to, whether we like it or not. It's going to be forced on us one way or another. So as we're in such a mess, and a lot of the mess is in areas that are devolved to the Scottish Government, like our health service, our justice system, our education system, energy policy. All of that is devolved to Holyrood. All of it's a disaster. And yet they keep blaming everyone else for it other than themselves. They're not taking responsibility. When they have a committees of inquiries, it's loaded up with SNP supporters. That's no good to Scotland or the Scottish people. We need the whole of Scotland to come together if we're going to get an independent country sometime in the future. And I don't think that now is the time to be looking at that at all. But then I start to look at, say, well, how can Scotland do better? And the problem really is that everyone that runs anything in Scotland seems to be thick as two short planks, if you don't mind me saying so. We've got an awful lot of really stupid people in Scotland. And I think it's time we found people with vision and drive to do things differently. And that's what I want to use this video to do, is I want to talk about some of these things and hope will make you think, and maybe together we can find a way forward. So if I talk maybe first of all about the NHS and our health service, clearly it's running into a lot of problems because we've run out of money. And every public service needs more money, but we don't have the money. So what can we do about it? All we can really do is reduce our costs. To me, that's the only solution. Either that, or we have to tax people higher, get better exports so we make more money, so we can afford to pay more money. But to my mind, that doesn't seem to be an option right now. So we have to find ways to save money. And if I look at the whole health service, it strikes me that the major problems on our health service is to do with obesity. Obesity is the cause of diabetes, heart attacks, all this kind of stuff. And so if you tackle that and reduce it dramatically, then you should dramatically reduce the costs of the health service. And how do we do that? Well, I've got two specific thoughts on that. One is, we need the education service to do a better job in schools, educating our kids on how to cook and how to create nutritious meals that are better for us. But we also need chefs to help us, because too many of these so-called celebrity chefs, there's so much money that they obviously don't know how to live on the minimum wage. And I think what we should do is we should take maybe 3 example families that are all struggling on a minimum wage or even below, and examine carefully how much money they have to spend on food, and then find out how they're feeding themselves right now. And a lot of them may be going to food banks to get extra food. But I think we need to take these so-called chefs and say, okay, for a month, you work out recipes where they can feed themselves, fill their bellies so they feel full after they've eaten something, on that amount of money. You go figure it out. And if they can't figure it out, then they're no use to us. But I've got suggestions on that front. And it's based on me reading news from all over the world. For example, in India, in one of the states in India, they have a whole bunch of small restaurants that the local member of parliament has actually built. And they give you a breakfast, you can go there for lunch or for dinner, and they only offer you maybe 2 options for each. But they're all about 7 to 9 cents equivalent, so it's 4 pence. I'm not saying we can get food at that price in Scotland, but the thing is that they give you a filling meal that's also nutritious. And you don't really see fat Indians when you look at any of the shows or anything. They're all pretty slim. And so how do you do that? I mean, I'm maybe calling for a state restaurants in Scotland that are literally all over Scotland. And you can go to these places and get a really cheap, nutritious meal for next to nothing, or very cheap. And one of the ways I think you can do that is by helping the farmers. I mean, you must have seen some of these shows where they talk about the food waste. About a third of all the food bought is actually wasted and thrown out. And you've seen these supermarkets where you go to their bins, there's perfectly good food in these waste bins that they've thrown out. And it's because of it's partly because they won't buy anything but perfect vegetables. I mean, what was that parsnip farm that did parsnips? They would only accept perfect parsnips. If it was a bit crooked or bent, it wasn't allowed. It was just ditched. And on top of that, I think it was Tesco was the problem. I might be wrong there, but it was one of the big chains. They could just cancel an order like that. So even though they had perfectly good pasta, all of a sudden they were due to deliver it that day, but they got a late cancellation of the order and they had to ditch the product. That's unacceptable. And so I think anything that's grown on our farms that is good and healthy and is okay to eat should be given to these supermarkets. And there should be a law passed in Scotland that supermarkets cannot pick and choose of the style or look of the vegetable. As long as it's healthy and good, it should be stocked in their stores. And if they try to say, well, we want it this length, we want it this size, then they should be prosecuted for that. But that's one thing I think we could do. And I think that way we would end up with cheaper vegetables. Because that parsnip place, I think it was one day that 90% of the crop had to be just reburied in the ground. It was unacceptable to the supermarket. That's a fantastic waste of food. The other thing is, if we had these state restaurants, or food kitchens, or whatever you want to call them, then surely they could go to these farms and say, we'll buy all that surplus stuff from you. Because after all, they'll be peeling it and cutting up into pieces, so we won't know what it looks like anyway. It's just because it will taste just as good as the perfect stuff, perfect looking stuff would taste. That way we could perhaps get together a really good way to feed people with a very cheap but nutritious meal. And that way, if more people were eating that kind of food, then we wouldn't have the obesity problem, and if we wouldn't have the healthcare costs associated with things like heart attacks and diabetes and so forth. So that's one area. Is you need to educate kids as to what all this food is, how to cook it, how it tastes, and all that. So there should be these kind of courses at school to teach kids about that. The chefs should get involved, showing how you can make nutritious and cheap food. And then state canteens around Scotland where you can go and get a really cheap but nutritious meal. I think by doing all of that, we could cut obesity enormously. The other aspect of the healthcare system is medicine. Apparently we're over-medicating. I mean, I know in Canada there's a new committee that's been set up because they realise that too many doctors just keep repeating pain prescriptions. And I think there's a lot of people getting hooked on these pain prescriptions. And so he's becoming like a drug addict. And the GPs don't have the time to really examine, okay, I gave you these pills for a week to sort this problem out. Has it fixed it? No, it hasn't. Well, why hasn't it fixed it? Because I'm not giving you any more pain medicine. I need to find out the root cause. No one's going to just keep prescribing the same medicines. That's costing billions in Scotland. We need to stop that. So, quickly, that's areas that I think we should be looking at as far as that goes. And if we cut billions off our costs because of that activity, then we can spend more money in our hospitals, get more GPs, and also give them better working hours. Because if you've got more GPs, they spread the workload. That means that they're not all working at huge 12-hour days all the time, or 14-hour days for that matter all the time. So that's the first thing that I think we need to deal with. And I say if we deal with that properly, we're going to reduce our costs enormously. And then we can afford to plough some of that savings into better, getting more GPs, and I say better high-tech stuff. I mean, for example, the other day I noticed that a lot of people get shaky hands when they get older. Well, there's this new audio system they put on the brain which can actually stop that. And I just watched it last night, I think it was. The guy with a really, really shaky hand. And by the time he came out, and it was just, so he was wide awake, but it just focused that sound on his brain, particular bit of the brain. And when he came out, his hand was steady as anything. Fixed the problem. Amazing. It's very early research days, but clearly it fixed his problem, and it's very encouraging, and so we need to invest in that as well. The next area I want to talk about is education, because clearly education is done very poorly under the SNP government. Scotland used to be considered to be the best place in the world to be educated. That's certainly no longer true. The latest PISA scores that came out just the other day there show that Scotland's only average, in fact mostly below average, on maths, science and reading. That's just terrible. I mean, some of the greatest science discoveries being made in the world have come from Scotland. But clearly our education system is definitely flawed. And I think it's flawed right across the board. I no longer, I think a lot of the people that go for degrees at university are getting degrees that mean nothing and won't get them jobs when they leave. I think we've got to re-examine it. I think a lot of the professors at university are lazy people and greedy people. They're in it for the money. I mean, a lot of them went to school, went to university and stayed in the university system to do their degrees, postgraduates, all this kind of stuff, and just became professors. They've never left the education system. And they're all getting paid big fat salaries. I mean, it's time we stop that. We've got to get some of these educators into ordinary jobs for a little bit so they contribute something. I have no time for universities these days at all. Changed my mind totally on that. I know that there's very good apprentice schemes around, and a lot of people that go for these apprentice schemes instead of going to university actually end up doing good jobs like electricians, mechanics, carpenters, plumbers and so forth. And a lot of them are earning a damn sight more than the people that went to university and got these big 40 degrees. So, and as I say, teachers are being way overworked. The curriculum for excellence has been a bit of a disaster for Scotland so far anyway. We know that teachers are working 12, 14 hours a day. That's unacceptable, and we're getting great difficulty in getting people into the teaching profession because they look at it and say, "I'm not getting that much in the way of money, and look at the hours I've got to put in to get that. No thanks, I'll do something else." So I think we need really good top teachers to get involved. And frankly, one of the big problems with the SNP is they only want to use SNP supporters to make the decisions. And that should be illegal. If we're going to have a committee to look at it, then no more than 50% of that committee should be SNP supporters. We should insist the other 50% are other parties or independents or whatever. Because we need to get good thinking in these committees. But the SNP have their favourites, and they keep using them time after time after time, and nothing happens in Scotland. We're just going downhill. Bad news. So education needs to change, and I think education needs to be driven by teachers and the people that really know the business. Then I think the next area I feel we need to look at is the justice system in Scotland, because it's a disaster. And again, this is just another devolved responsibility of the SNP government. But they made a mess of it. They closed the court offices. They're trying to get things into bigger centres all the time. That's what they seem. They seem to think the bigger the better. And it's totally wrong. I mean, was it the Dundee Courier did an investigation into the court system? And they found, like, when they went to spend a day at court, 90% of the cases had to be held over, or because a witness hadn't turned up, or even the person being prosecuted hadn't turned up. I mean, it's unacceptable. There's got to be changes. And then if you look at our Supreme Court in Scotland decided the named person scheme was perfectly okay. But it was appealed to the Supreme Court in England, and what happened? They had to throw it out. Why did they throw it out? Because it was against EU human rights. Because if a named person got information on a kid, they could just pass it however they wanted without referring to anyone. And that was against the human rights. Quite rightly too. But there's our top judges ruling on something like that, and they missed the essential human rights legislation that we've got in. So they're stupid, these people. Or they're not doing their job, they're not working hard enough, and not being diligent enough. And that's unacceptable, especially at that high level. So if the top judges are so ignorant, what did you do with the rest of the legal system? The legal system's a mess in Scotland. It used to be the best in the world again. But tinkering around the edges. Then you look at our police force. Police force is bad. Because they've made a whole big conglomerate. Again, this is the SNP. We want one police service. That means we won't have all the duplicate costs, they thought. Ended up costing us an absolute fortune. In fact, I think the recent plea is that this police service, we need another 85 million. And one of the problems is the SNP mandated we must have X number of police officers. And the only way you can cut your costs is by reducing the number of police officers. But apparently we need more. And what are the more giving us? I mean, what's happening is they've got rid of the special call centres staff that they use to take the 999 calls and stuff like that. And they've closed some of them. They've reduced the staff in some of them, which has often meant they've got to get actual police officers in to help at certain times. And they obviously cost a heck of a lot more money than the call centre staff did. And the call centre staff have built up expertise over a number of years. That's all gone. And now they're talking about bringing in the transport police service into Police Scotland, getting rid of that as well. And there's a lot of people saying that's just ridiculous. Because you need special skills for the transport police side of things. That's an entirely different kind of work. But they just want to lump them in with the big Police Scotland, which is now not working for us, as it were. I mean, a lot of the local police offices have been closed. They've sold off the property. You can only sell off property once. Once it's gone, it's gone. So, that's bad news. And then, to me, agriculture and fishing. I mean, I've mentioned agriculture from the point of view is we could support our farmers by mandating the supermarkets must take all their produce. Unless, of course, it's bad. But if it's a bit crooked and stuff like that, they should be forced to take it. End of story. And if they've got an order in, they should accept the order. And we've got to mandate that they don't throw out perfectly good food. I mean, that's where we need court decisions to make sure that these laws are put in force. So we could help our agriculture system, but the SNP put a new computer system in force to pay the EU grants to the farmers and give them loans. That's been a disaster. And just the other day, the civil service admitted, while it's a lot better, they still can't guarantee that it's going to be accurate and could take another year or so to get it that way. That's all the SNP's fault. It's all on them. But they won't accept responsibility. It's all Westminster's fault. It's all Westminster's fault. I'm so sick fed up of saying that. It's never their fault. It's always someone else's fault. Then you look at the fishing industry. Fishing industry should be bringing us in $2.5 billion in annual revenue. But because of EU regulations and mismanagement and the SNP not standing up for the fishing industry, we've lost 100,000 jobs in that sector. And that wasn't just fishermen. It was all the support industries like the boat builders, the net makers, the mechanics, electricians. A whole industry was around the fishing industry. Most of that's gone now. That's probably going to cost us quite a bit of money to build that back up because of SNP mismanagement. Then, the next thing I would tend to look at is energy. Yes, they've done a good job of getting us clean energy, but the big problem is storage of that energy. I mean, wind farms going with nice wind, we're getting power. But there's days we don't have any wind, and therefore there's no power. So we need storage facilities to carry us over on these quiet days. But yet the SNP has no policy in force to create those storage capacities. I mean, this cries out for a new industry, storage of power, batteries. And that's maybe where we should be investing money for the future, because if we can get a really good battery that stores power longer, and it's smaller in size, it could be a great start for an electric car industry in Scotland. And because our steel industry is still here, and with being outside the EU, we can put tariffs against cheap Chinese steel, protecting our industry, that we could then build our own cars. But that takes vision and enterprise, of which there's very little in Scotland, I have to say. And then if you look at diplomacy and Brexit and the Commonwealth and the EU, it seems Scotland's got no idea how to deal with the world. No idea at all. I mean, Nicola Sturgeon's an idiot. We must be in the EU even if Scotland's out. Of course, that means trade barriers. And our largest export market by far is England. She wants to put a hard barrier up? She's an idiot. Besides, I mean, why would the EU want Scotland? Oil's of no importance anymore. Fishing, no real importance anymore, because the Scottish industry's gone, almost. So, even if we control our own fishing, there aren't enough Scottish boats to go out there and do the fishing. So, Scotland gives nothing to the EU, really, at the end of the day. And we've got this huge debt to GDP ratio. So, why the EU would even want Scotland, and I don't know. I have no idea why they would say yes to Scotland. And frankly, I don't think they would. So this crying that we must be in there is ridiculous. Then you've got the whole idea that SNP and Nicola Sturgeon herself castigated Donald Trump, took away his Scottish ambassadorial role, called him all the names under the sun, and then supported Hillary Clinton. There was no need for her to get involved in the US elections at all, but she stuck her big nose in. And what's happened? Now Donald Trump is the most powerful guy in the world, and she's alienated him. And of course we don't know what they said in their phone call. It may well be, well, Nicola, guess who's in power now? You want to do business? You better think again, love. We don't know what he said to her. Of course, he might be big in McNabbs because he's a half Scot after all. So, he may still be nice to Scotland. But I don't see why he should be nice to her, because she was vitriolic against him, as was the SNP government. So that's come home to roost. And remember, she didn't need to get involved in that at all, but she chose to get involved in it, and now she's going to suffer the consequences. So, I think also the one other thing I think we need to look at new industries and how to build new industries up. And as I say, I do think a Scottish car might be one way to go, especially if we did very good on, because electric cars are going to be where we're going in the future, and we could be working on things like that. I know we do pretty well in other areas like bios and stuff like that. But again, the trouble really is that we don't learn much from Scotland at all. Scottish companies are pretty pathetic when it comes to communicating about what they're doing. They just don't want to talk about it. And that's stupidity, because it's not only them, it's how Scotland's perceived. So Scottish companies would talk about how they're doing, be willing to give you articles to put out there in the press and websites and stuff like that. You could learn so much more, and therefore your perception of Scotland could turn because of it. But unfortunately, the CEOs of most of Scottish companies are idiots. I mean, I'm sorry to say it, they're absolute idiots. I think they're so focused on making money, they don't consider promoting Scotland to be part of what they do. And that's a real shame, a real shame. But that's Scotland today for you. It's just not good at communicating. It's really, our people are getting dumber. That's a fact. We don't seem to be seeing the world as an opportunity. I mean, they talk about the 500 million in the EU. I mean, do they not realise that 2.3 billion people live in the Commonwealth countries of this world? A lot of them from the Asia bloc, which is a big developing market of the future. That's where we should be focusing, on the Commonwealth countries, not the EU, which is in permanent decline. I mean, if you look the other day there, because of the Italian referendum, it's pretty clear to pretty well everyone there we've got a banking crisis coming up. And so somehow they've got to get out of the euro. But so many countries are tied in with the euro, and none of them have done well as a result. And to come out of the euro, you have to come out of the EU. So where is the EU going these days? I mean, that's why Nicola Sturgeon, because she doesn't know the world and how the world works, is just not looking at any of that. I mean, she might be doing her damnedest to get us into the EU somehow or other. She might just manage it as the EU is falling apart. A lot of people are basically today saying the eurozone is going to die. Give it another year and it's probably gone. I mean, Italy could sort their problems out if they were out of the euro. I mean, luckily Britain never went in, and therefore our currency can fluctuate. And it has done since we had Brexit. But if you look at the way that exports have grown as a result, it's quite amazing. Yes, we'll pay a bit higher for imports, but I think our exports are actually overcompensating for that, because as a country, we're doing extremely well right now. We are the best performing country in the EU right now. So all I'm saying really is that I think Scotland needs more vision, and the SNP need to be more inclusive of the whole of Scotland, not just their party. But if we notice the last YouGov poll was showing that the appetite for independence has actually dropped slightly, and she thought with this Brexit that people would automatically be more into getting into they would definitely want to stay in the EU, and therefore would vote for independence. Second time around, that is looking increasingly doubtful, I have to say. As I say, the last YouGov poll was indicating that support for independence had dropped by 1%. That's not much, but the thing is, that's that 10% gap. Remember, 55 voted to stay in the UK as against 45 for independence. Well, if that's dropped by another percent, it's certainly not making enough progress for her to win an independence referendum. And I think a lot of people in Scotland are starting now to question her whole motives by wanting to be in the EU. And so I think just people need to start thinking and realising that there are great opportunities out there in the world. I mean, certainly with Britain being out of the EU, we can now do our own deals with the US, Canada, China, India, Japan, all over. And almost all these countries are queuing up wanting to do free trade deals with us. All of them. But being in the EU can't do that because the EU has to negotiate every trade deal that's not amongst the EU countries. Therefore, we've never been able to. And that's one of the reasons that we're delaying this Brexit, because we needed to build up our trade negotiators and diplomats again, because we're going to have to engage the world. And I think the opportunities post-Brexit are amazing. But Nicola clearly doesn't think so. So I think we need a big change of attitude in Scotland. Really do, a big change in attitude. I think Scotland needs to be more inclusive, and we need to do much better educating our kids so we get brighter kids coming out, improve our education system, sort out our healthcare system, sort out the justice system, and as I say, have a vision for how we could take on the world. So anyway, that's my views. I hope some of these things have resonated with you, and I hope maybe you'll feel free to give feedback and let me know what you think. Okay, thank you.